Welcome back to the Sandton Convention Center, where the second annual investment conference is currently taking place. In fact, it's going to be underway in a few minutes from now. And one of the key important elements of attracting investment into the country was the appointment of investment envoys, who were obviously tasked in making sure that they streamline this project of getting investment into the country. Those were 4 investment envoys that were appointed, and one of them is the former Deputy Finance Minister, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, who's joined us in studio this morning to take us through the progress really that they have made as envoys. Mr. Jonas, thank you so much for making time to speak to us at the SABC. How far are we now? You were tasked with getting investment, and your target, if I remember correctly, was about 100 billion rand. How far are you?
Look, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this interview. We've made a lot of progress in many senses. If you recall, the target was 1.2 trillion. And in our first investment conference, we had commitments amounting to about 300 billion. And most of them are in the stage of implementation as we speak. The bulk of those commitments were local. And of course, you had foreign companies that also made pledges at the time. And all of those are currently in implementation stage. We've also gone around the world to talk to investors, potential investors, initially to just sense what they think about South Africa,
yes,
what their concerns were, and secondly, I think to start feeding it into government in terms of strategy for creating a more conducive environment for investment. So that work has been pretty much successful, but also difficult.
I'm also curious to hear what investors make of South Africa currently and the climate really that they would be investing into.
Look, you must also look at that within a global context. Because I think, let's face it, the global economic environment is difficult. The global economy remains weak, basically, and growth projections are very weak globally. Attitude to emerging markets is not that great equally. Of course, it's improving very fast, as it were. So South Africa, you must look at it within that context, that difficult environment. Concerns around South Africa have been around policy, lack of policy consistency, the fact that I think our policy signaling has sometimes been confusing. There was concerns around corruption, state capture. There's also been concerns around the capacity of the state to effect economic reform, as it were, and the slowness of the pace of economic reform. Of course, you would also appreciate that all of these things are not short-term issues. We have to take time to deal with them. At least we can say pretty much with certainty that there's been a lot of progress in terms of creating a more certain policy environment.
Yes.
We've actually kind of cleared up the bottlenecks around mining policy, energy policy, and a whole range of other, and land policy, land reform policy, which is a positive for signaling. Of course, we still have to do a lot of work in other areas.
When we look at the economic metrics, Mr. Jonas, we look at what the midterm budget, projected. I know that there was an issue of the debt to GDP, which is projected to go over 70%, our growth rate of 0.5%. As Africa's most industrialized economy, that is actually very low, that we can't even reach 1%. This surely will make things a lot more difficult of your work going forward, will it not?
Look, growth is a problem. I know that people tend to like to raise fiscal policy as a big issue. It is a big issue as to manage debt, etc. But ultimately, whether your debt is manageable or not is a function of how your economy is growing. So growth is central to the project, the new project that we have. And again, there are a number of initiatives underway to try to unleash growth. Now, growth, again, is a function of investment.
Of course.
So without investment, you're unlikely to have growth, as it were. And I think this kind of conference helps to bolster the efforts to grow the economy. But again, making huge policy changes would also help create a better environment for investment and therefore prospect for growth. There are a number of other areas. like how do you improve education outcomes, because that's a fundamentally important thing.
It is.
Again, I always make the point that we are what economists will call a middle income trap.
Okay.
In the sense that if you look at our unemployment, primarily we are not competitive in the labor-intensive sectors of production sectors. Equally, because of a whole range of things, but we're also not competitive in the high skill intensive sections of production because of education outcomes and other things like that. So how do you deal with the problem that bind? So sitting in the middle where your jobs are not growing because you can't grow your labor intensive part, and of course you can't grow jobs on the top. So how do you unbind that? And there are two actually interesting ways of doing that. One, I think it's very important that in the immediate we need to look at incentivizing labor-intensive production, and I think using all sorts of instruments. The second one is obviously beginning to use education more effectively.
Mr. Jonas, thank you so much. We're looking forward to hear what the president is going to be saying, and if this indeed will appease the investors who have come here to hear what the plans for South Africa is. Thank you so much for making time to speak to us at the SABC. That is the former Deputy Finance Minister, Mcebisi Jonas. Is also one of the 4 investment envoys who have been appointed to spearhead this project of getting investment into the country. And before I hand over to the studio, I'm sure that Valen is getting ready for her sports, and with that I'll hand over back to her.